Welcome everyone to part 2 of Alan's masterclass in hydration. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Alan and he can get started.
All right, thank you, Scott. Yeah, and as Scott said, this is obviously part 2. So if you're watching the recording of this or you're live and you missed the first part, we talked about, I guess, hydration before and after exercise, whereas today we're going to focus on specifically hydration during exercise. And this also dovetails really nicely onto the stuff that Scott talked about last week, which was actually using the Fuelin app to do your sweat rate testing as well. And so we'll look at some examples of that and how to use and interpret that data and how to put that into action in terms of planning for race day as well. Obviously, I'm going to talk particularly about race day today, but all of these principles you can apply to training as well, particularly some of your longer training sessions, particularly if you're in a hot environment and you're training, through summer now in the Northern Hemisphere, then it can be particularly relevant also for that. So what we're going to look at today is firstly, how much fluid do we need to replace during a race? Is there a rule of thumb that we can kind of apply to that? How do we figure out what that actually looks like for me in terms of, knowing how much fluid I need personally, planning that for race day? What does that look like? And also we need to consider, obviously, that those fluids might contain carbohydrate and electrolytes as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the practical things about not just how much fluid, but what sort of fluid, how you access that fluid, how your sort of setup is from a planning perspective also. So I think most people will be probably familiar with Scott, Elizabeth, and myself, so I won't spend any more time on this. Obviously, Scott does some of these presentations, Elizabeth does some, I do some, and then we have the Ask Us Anything once a month where the three of us are on the call as well. So as I said, we've looked at before and after exercise in the previous session. So if you aren't across that, you can go back and have a look at the recording of those. We gave some nice examples of like a little model you can use to work out, am I hydrated this morning before I go and do my training session? And if not, what do I do about it? And we talked about post-exercise, how much fluid do we actually need to replace after exercise to rehydrate? So I'm not going to cover those today. You can go back and have a look at that recording if you've missed that. But today we're going to focus on the during exercise component. And as I mentioned last time, this is the area that's probably been a little bit more controversial over the years as well. So we'll talk a bit about why that is and where we're at now. Okay. So during exercise, how much fluid should I actually be looking to replace? And this is probably the controversial area. And I think some of the controversy around this has come from people that probably have quite different perspectives and work with different types of athletes in different types of events. So I guess the traditional model has been, trying to prevent more than about 2% body weight loss during exercise. That's been a very common and consistent guideline in the sort of the main, American College of Sports Medicine type guidelines over, a few decades now. Where the controversy has come is probably from more so people who work in the ultra endurance scene, not just Ironman, but thinking even longer than that. So your ultra marathons and that sort of thing, where they've seen situations of over drinking and hyponatremia, which is a medical condition that can happen when you drink too much during exercise. And that's where they've sort of argued, oh, well, this focus on hydration has been overblown. It's causing people to put themselves into a hospital bed with overhydration and hyponatremia. And so you should just drink according to thirst. And, sometimes you'll lose more than 2% body weight. That's okay. That side of things. And I think these are kind of been two extreme ends of the scale. You've got one group of people that have been working with high performance athletes in probably shorter events, things like the marathon, often in very hot conditions where, dehydration or hypohydration, depending on which term you want to use, is probably more common and more of an issue. And then you have people working with ultra endurance athletes where there's ample access to fluid, better tolerance to fluid. Over a long period of time, it's possible to become significantly overhydrated. And so I think, you've got often there's been this sort of scientific controversy and, yelling matches and people throwing rocks via Twitter and things like that. But a lot of that, I think, is just because they come at that from working with different athletes and come from different perspectives. So let's try and work our way through the middle of all of that and see what we can do. So I guess the first thing is, what is actual hypohydration or dehydration? It's probably when you lose more than about 2 to 3% of your body weight as water. And that's the important part, as water, because in exercise up to about 3 or 4 hours, even the 70.3, probably body weight loss equals sweat loss. And we can be pretty confident with that. But as you get up to sort of Ironman distance or into some of the ultra stuff in the trail running scene, for example, you start to get into a situation where body weight loss is not the same as fluid loss. And actually you would lose more body weight. So a 2% body mass loss of fluid might be a 4 or 5% body weight loss overall. So that's something just important to bear in mind. So once we lose more than about 2 to 3% of body mass, we start to see what I talked about last time is sort of higher heart rate as part of that stress response to exercise, higher body temperature because we have less fluid in the body. That has some implications in terms of, one, there's less water to soak up that excess heat. Two, eventually when we become dehydrated, we start to produce less sweat, although that takes a fair bit of dehydration to get to that point. But I guess the final and most important one is impairment of performance. And again, this is where some of the controversy has been. And I think some of that is, if you talk to the guys who do this research, is because probably the point where people's performance becomes impaired is different in different people and is possibly different in different types of events as well. So this is where it becomes very hard to make this hard and fast rule of 2% or whatever it is. But at this stage, it's probably the best we have. Probably 2 to 3% is probably suitable for things like Ironman. Maybe slightly more you could get away with, but probably not much more than that before performance becomes impaired for most people. We can talk about Haile Gebrselassie breaking the marathon world record with a 9% body mass loss, but again, that's an outlier. That's an exception, not the rule.
Alan, couple of questions there. Yeah. You mentioned obviously 2 to 3% of that body mass lost through water. What would the rest of the loss be a result of?
Yeah. So in really long duration exercise, you start to, because you're just burning up so much carbohydrate and fat over 5, 10, 15 hours of exercise, you start to actually lose body fat to the point where it shows up on the scales. You obviously use up glycogen, the carbohydrate that was stored in your muscles and your liver prior to exercise. There's maybe half a kilo there as well. So yeah, these things just start to add up over time to the point where it makes a noticeable difference in body weight that's not a fluid difference.
Has there ever been like quantified sort of body mass changes through like DEXA before and after, say, an Ironman or anything like that, to look at what sort of percentage of body fat loss there could be, or glycogen, things like that?
Not that I'm aware of. Part of the problem with DEXA is that even DEXA is not perfect for these things, and even it's not immune from changes in fluid. And because you have so many fluid ins and outs during exercise, it's probably not going to give you a reliable estimate of body composition.
Yeah, fair enough. And then the other thing, in terms of that impaired performance, obviously, that 2 to 3% and the individual differences in, performance measures as a result of that 2 to 3%. But we do see athletes sort of go into that, you hinted at 9%, but even way below that, of finishing a 70.3 at maybe 4 or 5%. Is there anything wrong potentially with that 4 or 5% body mass loss through water weight in those 70.3 sort of type race durations?
Well, just that, you might have a higher body temperature, a higher heart rate, and worse performance than you would have otherwise.
Do you ever see athletes, and my understanding is, as you improve as an athlete, as your status or you become more elite, they can deal with those changes in heat better than others? And again, is it all to do with the individual athlete and how they cope with that degree of loss, how that affects the individual as opposed to the blanket sort of recommendation? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hypothesis. The problem is no one's ever been able to sort of test it. So we don't know for sure. But that's the theory at the moment, is that some people, their performance might just start to become impaired at 1.5% body mass loss. Other people might be 4% body mass loss. We don't know we can't predict who will be in which category or the other. So we can't really make individualized recommendations at this stage, unfortunately.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. So I guess I'd call sort of mild hyperhydration, or hypohydration, I should say, is where you lose sort of less than 2 to 3% of your body water loss. So you're going to have minimal change in your heart rate at the same pace, minimal loss in performance. And that's ultimately where you want to sit most of the time. You do expect to lose some fluid during exercise that isn't replaced, and that's okay. It's not going to put you in a hospital bed. It's not going to cause this catastrophic loss of performance if you lose, 1 or 2% body mass loss. And in fact, may actually be desirable to do that. The flip side to that is overhydration, where you actually drink, basically you replace either 100% or more of your fluid losses during exercise. So you've either not lost any weight at all, or in fact, you've gained weight during exercise. I guess the downsides to this, the more mild and inconvenient ones, are that you have to pee a lot during your race, which is not very nice. As I said, the more greater concerns are things like hyponatremia, where you basically dilute all the dissolvable bits in your blood. That water then moves into your cells, expands all the cells, and can cause some major problems when that expansion happens in your brain and there's no room within your skull for your brain to swell up and expand. So basically, the bottom line is that no one should be aiming to replace every single drop of fluid they lose during exercise, and no one should definitely aim to be gaining weight during exercise. That's a big red flag. And what we know is that, complete fluid replacement, there's no advantage in doing that over that kind of mild hyperhydration, what we have in the middle there. So there's some risks involved. At least you have to pee a lot, and that's inconvenient. And there's no advantage to doing that. So we generally wouldn't go in with a plan to do that.
Alan, question on that is, with a sport like triathlon, obviously, coming off the bike into the run, 70.3, maybe not such a big deal, but potentially with an Ironman, is there any research and is there any sort of anecdotal support to maybe trying to stay at least close to a euhydrated, or potentially maybe into a mild overhydrated state on the bike if they know that the run is going to be incredibly hot? Say, think of Kona, where they have that individual has a high sweat rate and they know they typically struggle in the heat. Is there, from your anecdotal experience,
because you just expect that you're not going to be able to replace enough fluid during the run. Yeah,
correct.
Look, I wouldn't suggest that you try and overhydrate, because you're just going to pee out the excess fluid anyway. But you might be a little bit more aggressive, only aiming for 1% body mass loss by the end of the bike or something like that, knowing that you'll then end up the run sort of 3% down. I guess the other thing I'd say there is, and we'll talk a bit about this later on, is if you are struggling to drink enough during the run, that's trainable. You can improve that over time. And so sometimes athletes need to work on that as well.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
All right. So obviously many of you will have gone out and done sweat rate testing, and obviously Scott ran through how to do that in the app last week. So if you're not familiar with that, or you missed that session, you might want to go back and have a look at the recording. This is some data that was collected from over 1,000 sweat tests by the folks at Gatorade. Some of these are lab tests, some of these are outdoor tests in the field, and these are across a variety of sports. But what you see is this big cluster around the 500 to 1,500 mils per hour mark. Over 80% of all the tests sit within that range. 70% of the tests sit within that range. Now, you'll see some extreme values up to sort of 4 liters an hour or more. These were generally American footballers training in the middle of summer with their full protective gear, their helmets and everything on. Really big guys, extreme environment, lots of clothing that prevents that sweat from evaporating off their body and cooling them down. That's why you see such extreme sweat rates, but you generally won't see that in endurance sports. You might see up to 2, maybe 2.5 liters an hour in some circumstances. What determines sweat rate during exercise is a combination of your exercise intensity, so the pace, and the environment. So exercise intensity, I think, is often underappreciated in its role in sweat rate. So obviously, if you're pushing, 150 watts on the bike, you're producing a certain amount of calories per minute or per hour. 80% of that calories is converted to heat. That's just the inefficiency of human metabolism. And that heat has to be gotten rid of from the body, and our body produces sweat to help us do that. Now, if we suddenly ride at 300 watts, then we're producing double the amount of energy, double the amount of heat. We have to get rid of that heat. Our sweat rate will increase in proportion to that. And likewise, the environment has an important factor here. So the hotter the environment, the harder it is to get rid of that heat to the atmosphere. And so the more you have to get that through evaporation of sweat rather than other methods of sort of radiation of heat out from the body or convection away from the body. And so again, you tend to have a higher sweat rate. In humid conditions, it tends to be a little bit higher as well, because sweat evaporates less effectively and it tends to drip off your body, and sweat that drips off your body does nothing to cool you down. It has to evaporate for it to actually remove that heat from your body. And so you tend to see higher sweat rates in humid weather compared to dry weather as well. So one thing, obviously, with an Ironman is it's a long race. And so the conditions, I'll show you an example of this shortly from Kona, are going to change across the day. And so you won't expect your sweat rate to stay the same throughout the entire race. Even if your pace stayed exactly the same, you were sort of metronomic, your sweat rate would still go up and down because the weather is changing over time. But I guess what we can say here is 500 mils to 1500 mils an hour is where most people will sit most of the time, somewhere within that range. Okay, so how do we know what exactly your sweat rate is going to be? Well, obviously, Scott went through that with the app last week, so I'm not going to sort of rehash over that. You can obviously enter your data and work out what your sweat rate is going to be. And as I said, it's going to be a moving target. So this is some weather data from race day of Kona, I think last year off the top of my head. And I've sort of overlaid here the portion of this, which was swim, bike, and run for someone. I can't remember what the finish time was here, but someone that was fairly competitive as an age grouper, I think. And so you can see, at the coolest part of the day, it started off, about 77 degrees, something like that. So once they hit the bike course, it's just sort of ticked over about 81 degrees. And then by the time they get to the run, it's well over 85 degrees. Now, that's not a big discrepancy on this particular day, but it is probably enough to impact on sweat rate to some extent, that your sweat rate at the start of the bike will probably be lower than it was at the end of the bike. The run in this case was probably a bit of a flat line. But I've got an athlete racing the Badwater Ultra Marathon next week, and that's out in Death Valley in the desert. And that can be as cool as, 15 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure, Scott, you'll know what that is in Fahrenheit, at night. And then during the day, it can be 50 degrees, which is probably about 110, 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the heat of the day.
From 60 up to 115.
Yeah. So literally doubling or more in temperature. So that's a situation where sweat rate is going to vary massively. And so if we do a sweat rate test as a one-off test and say, this is my number, this is how much fluid I need, it's probably going to be a massive underestimate in some times of the day and possibly a massive overestimate in other times of the day. So we're trying to hit a moving target here, essentially. Now, the other problem is that depending on what information we have, we're often trying to hit a moving target while blindfolded. And what I mean by that is, as we're going along during exercise, you're out on the bike course and obviously the weather's changing, you're drinking a certain amount of fluid, but at any given time, you can't just stop and weigh yourself or do some sort of measurement and go, well, how hydrated am I in this exact moment? So the target is moving because your sweat rate is changing, but you don't actually know where you stand at any given time to be able to adjust for that necessarily. But we do have some clues. So what can we actually use to kind of peek under the blindfold a little bit? Well, we've got a couple of things. We have hopefully some sweat rate data that we've got from the Fuelin app, and we've got our sensation of thirst. So I'll come back to thirst in just a second, but we can have a look at our data. As Scott discussed last week, we have a look at what our peak sweat rate is in the conditions that we expect for the race. We can have a look at what our average sweat rate is likely to be for that race. The other thing which doesn't show in the summary data, and Scott and I were talking about this morning, but you can go back and look through your historical records, is what's the lowest kind of sweat rate I might expect in that race? And that can be really useful information as well from a planning perspective. So knowing kind of what is the lowest sweat rate I expect, what is the highest sweat rate I expect, and I'm going to sit somewhere and move up and down in between that across the day, gives you really good information in terms of planning your fluid, both at the lower end and the upper end. And I'll come back to that shortly. But the other thing, I guess, if we want to, I guess, a dipstick into, you know, where is my hydration in this particular moment? Am I over drinking? Am I under drinking? You know, in comparison to that moving target, really the only thing that we have to go on is our sense of thirst, which is why when you do the sweat tests, you know, tracking your sense of thirst can be really useful. And sometimes people find that their sense of thirst doesn't really guide them very well. And again, that's why doing sweat tests and measuring thirst in those tests can give you really valuable feedback, because you might be someone who says, well, I always tend to underdrink, but I never feel thirsty. So now I know that maybe I have to recalibrate my sense of, like, this is the thirst point at which I need to drink more. Or maybe I'm always thirsty and I end up over drinking. I actually gain weight during training when I'm thirsty. So in fact, in these cases, maybe my sense of thirst is going to tend me to overdrink. And so I actually need to pull back a little bit from that. So having a bit of an idea of where thirst is likely to get you, particularly in some of your longer sessions, is really important. And I say in the longer sessions because, you know, if you're trying to hit that 2% body weight loss, the amount of fluid you need to drink, if your session is half an hour, is probably nothing. You're not going to lose 2% in half an hour. But in a 10 or 15 hour race, you probably need to replace more than 90% of your fluid losses to end up within that 2%. And so that makes it tricky as well. Okay, so let's plan fluid for the race. And this is where having that minimum, average, and maximum expected sweat rates is so valuable. Because obviously our fluids provide us with water, but they're all going to provide us with carbohydrate as well for most people. You know, some people might completely separate their carbs into gels and food and things, and that's okay if that works for you. But for a lot of people, fluid is going to be one of their main vehicles to get carbohydrate into your body. So one of the things that we need to be careful about here is if we go out with the expectation we're going to be drinking 800 mils an hour of fluid during our race, and we plan all our carbohydrate around, you know, 800 mil bottles with our carbs in that bottle, but then it turns out to be a much cooler day than we expect, and we don't feel thirsty. And actually, if we drank 800 mils an hour, it will be too much. We end up overhydrated. All of a sudden, if I'm only drinking 400 mils an hour, I'm only getting half the amount of carbohydrate that I'd planned. So our fluid needs are going to go up and down depending on the day and what weather Mother Nature decides to produce on that day. It's also going to go up and down depending on, you know, the change in temperature over the day. But our carbohydrate needs should theoretically stay the same. We should be having the same amount of carbohydrate per hour, regardless of the weather, regardless of how much fluid we're drinking. So what we need to do here is have some way of going, okay, well, I need to have a certain amount of fluid every hour, no matter what, that is going to provide me with the carbohydrate I'm planning to have. And then I need a component of fluid that is flexible to move up and down based on thirst, based on the conditions on the day, which will vary from day to day, hour to hour. So what I've done here is said, well, let's look at what our minimum expected sweat rate is. And the example I've given here is 500 mils an hour, just as a nice round example. So I'm thinking no matter what happens, I'm always going to sweat at least 500 mils an hour, probably more for a lot of the day, but this is going to be the minimum. So therefore, I can plan my carbohydrate around this 500 mils an hour. In other words, let's plan to drink 500 mils an hour every hour of exercise that provides carbohydrate. Then in addition to that, I can drink according to thirst, more or less, depending on the hour, of carb-free fluid that then allows me to flex up and down my fluid intake as I need to. Now, the maximum sweat rate, I use that to plan my fluid availability. How much fluid do I have available to me, or can I access out on course? Because sometimes you can rely on aid stations rather than carrying every drop of fluid. And so if I know my maximum expected sweat rate in those conditions is 1100 mils an hour, that's when I'm going to say I need to be able to have access to 1100 mils an hour of fluid in my race, whether that's I'm carrying it on my bike, whether it's from aid stations, whatever it is. And so I can access this much is providing me carbohydrate, and I'm going to sit somewhere in the range in between those, using thirst as feedback in terms of where I should sit between those, and using those carb-free fluids to move up and down between those ranges. Okay.
Alan, I just I love this description. If you just go back, I think it's really great that to get athletes thinking about that use of carbohydrates. And it's something, if we go back to a Q&A session that I did, which was looking at using multiple forms of carbohydrates and the way in which the body can utilize those, and there doesn't seem to be much difference between fluids, chews, and gels, and ultimately it comes down to the athlete's preference. I think, just so the athletes out there understand exactly, in the way I see this from Alan, is he's saying if you are going to use fluid carbohydrates, then this is something to put into it. He's not saying that you only drink your carbs and it's 500 mils. It's just an example. That 500 mils of carbohydrates might be providing, could be providing 50 grams of carbs. If you need to get the other 50 grams in, or whatever it is your expected grams per hour is, you therefore are going to be eating those either in gel or block or bar format. So it's just thinking about how can you maximize using the fluid or your sweat rate data to provide you with the minimum amounts of carbs in liquid form if you are going to use those, and then applying all your other, the carb capacity data onto this to use gels and blocks and so on. So it's, yes, it, like initially it might seem a little bit complicated, but it's really just thinking about what your minimum needs are based on what you can do in training.
Yeah. And there's a question in the chat, is there a recommended split between liquid and solid carbs? Well, that is really going to vary depending on your sweat rate and depending on the weather in that event. If you're going to go and race in Kona where it is going to be hot, maybe your minimum expected fluid needs is going to be 800 or 900 mils an hour, in which case you could probably get all of your carbs in liquid form if you wanted to do that. Whereas if you're going to do a race in a very cold environment, maybe your minimum expected fluid need is only going to be 100 or 200 mils an hour, in which case you're going to struggle to get enough carbohydrate into 200 mils of fluid to actually meet your carbohydrate needs. And so you're going to be more reliant on the gels, the blocks, the food, and things like that to get that carbohydrate in. So it is going to vary from race to race, depending on the conditions and depending on your expected sort of minimum sweat rate. That gives you a sense of how realistic is it to get all of my carbohydrate from fluid versus not. And then also, as Scott said, it's personal preference. If you're someone who likes gels and blocks and food and things, either because you get hungry or you just prefer the taste and the flavor, then you can do that. It's not a problem. Or if you're someone who prefers all your carbohydrate to come in liquid form, then obviously the lower that minimum amount is, the more concentrated that carbohydrate has to be. And eventually it's probably going to get to a point where it's too concentrated. It's basically like a gel in a drink bottle.
Yeah. And I think, like, to emphasize this, and this is probably, sometimes when we're working one-on-one or with those, athletes who get consultations, this is exactly what we talk about, is like having a plan A and a plan B based on the race you're going to be doing. So don't just have a one size fits all in terms of your hydration strategy and your carb strategy, because as Alan pointed out, that strategy in Kona might be very different to a race. I don't know what was recent that was quite cool.
Poland the other week.
Yeah, like a race in Europe where it might be very, very cool temperatures. You've got to have that plan A and plan B and be flexible with your approach, knowing that you've practiced that in training with higher amounts of carbohydrate liquid versus lower amounts of carbohydrate liquid, and substituting in gels and blocks and whatnot to meet your carbohydrate requirements whilst also meeting your fluid requirements. And that the only way you can do that, and what Alan's really highlighting here, is through testing and practice, and deciphering that out yourself. Like, we can talk about the theory of all of this a lot, but ultimately it's that repeat testing to work out what that plan is. And then, getting some help with that and discussing that with someone like Alan, myself, or Elizabeth.
And that's why it's so important, as Scott mentioned last week, it's not just doing a sweat test once and saying, job done, I've done my sweat test. It's about building a profile of your sweat rate over, different weather conditions over the bike and the run, over the expected race pace, or if you want to apply the data back to training, the kind of pace that you're doing in training as well, to get an idea of what that expected minimum is for that scenario. And then you go and do a different race and it might be completely different, either because you're going from 70.3 to Ironman, so the pace is different, or you're going from a cold race to then go and race in Kona, and then that's a very different scenario as well. All right. So what about electrolytes? So obviously we've talked about carbohydrate. We need to think about electrolytes as well. And this could be an entire presentation in itself. And I actually did one last year on sodium before I joined Fuelin, actually, as a guest. So I'm going to try and simplify it here because it is actually quite a complicated situation, what we're now seeing with electrolytes. And when I say electrolytes, it's primarily sodium, is that the amount of sodium you need during exercise depends on not only how much sodium you lose, but also how much fluid you replace. And that's why it's hard to give a simple one-line answer. But I guess trying to be a bit more practical here, I've sort of said for events that are sort of 70.3 distance or below, probably the amount of sodium you need doesn't matter that much unless it's an extreme, 40 degree, above 100 degrees Celsius, very humid race or something like that. It probably actually doesn't matter, in which case you can choose the amount of sodium you put into your food and fluids based on taste preferences. And that can be helpful to encourage fluid intake. If you don't like the taste of what you're drinking, you're probably not going to drink it. If something's a little bit salty and it tends to make you a bit thirstier and want to drink, that's going to encourage you to drink more. And again, this might be different in different people. If you're someone who tends to overdrink during exercise, you probably might want to put things in place that actually limit your access to fluid or your desire for that fluid. But if you're someone who tends to underdrink during exercise and end up, 3, 4, 5% body mass loss at the end, then actually you probably want to adjust the flavor of your drinks to something that you really enjoy and encourages you to drink more. And so you can use the sodium from that perspective rather than getting super scientific about it. For Ironman events, or if you're doing sort of ultra marathon type things as well, then, as I said, it does depend on not only the sweat sodium loss, which is mainly the sweat sodium concentration, but also how much fluid you are replacing during exercise. So I've just given a quick example here. I've called it sort of Mr. or Miss Average. So someone who sweats at 1,000 mils, so a liter an hour, drinks about 80% of that, so 800 mils an hour, and a sweat sodium concentration of 920 milligrams per liter or 420 milligrams per pound. And that is pretty much the average kind of sweat sodium concentration that you see for most athletes. So you can run that, you can crunch the numbers on that, and it actually works out to be not that much sodium. It's only about 220 milligrams per hour or 275 milligrams per liter of fluid that's consumed, which is much lower than what a lot of the sort of personalized electrolyte replacement products out there would have you use. There are exceptions to that where you might need significantly more than that. But as I said, it's very difficult to give a one word or a one sentence answer to that. So I won't do that today. That would be an entire topic in itself.
Alan, where's the 220 milligrams per hour or 275 milligrams per liter coming from as a percentage of the sweat sodium loss per liter?
Yeah,
what percentage
30%.
are you basing that off?
It's 30%. And that's based on some modeling I did in some research last year. Yeah.
And so that, I think at the moment, so you're saying around 30%, and that could vary based on, is that where you would say to someone, perhaps start with around 30% of that estimated sweat sodium and then adjust as required based on elements such as thirst, cramping, perceived performance, things like that? If they do feel that they do better with slightly higher amounts of sodium, and maybe that is just purely gets them drinking more and actually replaces fluid, then do that. Like you can only
I don't think
30%.
I don't think there's going to be any harm in going dramatically over that, unless it's like ridiculously over that. Then you can run into trouble. And I guess for a lot of people, they're not necessarily going to know their sweat sodium concentration. So I've just applied the average value here. And the average kind of sweat rate and fluid replacement. So if you're more aggressive with your fluid replacement, that number starts to go up. If your sweat sodium concentration is higher, that number starts to go up. If your sweat rate is higher, the milligrams per hour number will go up, but the milligrams per liter won't. And vice versa, it will come down in those other kind of circumstances. But look, I think if you're slightly under or slightly over with your electrolytes, it's not going to be the end of the world. I think this focus on electrolytes as being the be all and end all is, as someone who's a sodium researcher, massively overrated. There is a role for them, certainly, and particularly the longer the event, the more important that becomes, simply because you have to get closer and closer to 100% fluid replacement to stay under that 2 to 3% body weight loss. But yes, again, you're trying to hit a moving target blindfolded. It's the same here. Sweat sodium concentration varies 10 to 20% day to day, even if you change nothing. Sweat rate to some degree as well. And so, saying this is my number, this is what I have to hit, in reality, it's probably a range or ballpark figure. And if you're somewhere around there, you're doing okay.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point for everyone to just, because I'm sure we're going to get some people saying, whoa, what's going on here? Like, think about your sweat rate. Your sweat rate is not a fixed number. Okay. As Alan's pointed out, depends on intensity. It depends on the environment. So you do not sweat at 800 mils per hour or that's just not your sweat rate. It will depend on a number of factors. And yes, your sodium amount, Alan, my understanding is it will relatively stay fairly fixed as a sweat.
It does vary based on a few things. How much?
But there or thereabouts,
but there or thereabouts, yeah.
What we're saying though is that amount of replacement is going to be a range as well, isn't it? Like, you don't have to replace 100% of that first and foremost. Like fluid, you don't have to replace 100%, and that range in amount of sodium could be dependent on the individual athlete. So Alan is saying, yes, start maybe with a lower amount of sodium and then adjust as required. And if you do know your sweat sodium concentration, you can take a factor of that. And maybe, from a health perspective, Alan, I have read some articles and some research papers about like the benefits of exercise being then outweighed by these huge sodium intakes. And it's like you exercise to reduce blood pressure and things like that. And then potentially you're consuming, 2000 milligrams of sodium per hour. And, does that outweigh the benefits? But I think what we're saying here is, yes, electrolytes are important. We're not saying that they're not, but perhaps you could potentially start at a lower amount and then build up based on how you actually are performing. And I've certainly seen this anecdotally with athletes where they were maybe consuming huge amounts of sodium for what they thought was required. They then suddenly drop it. They either notice no difference whatsoever, as in they're performing exactly the same way, but cutting their sodium intake by, 2/3 or 4/5, and still getting the same results, or actually they feel a little bit better and not maybe as thirsty and therefore reduce their total fluid consumption as well. So just so everyone just is very clear on that, we're not saying electrolytes are not necessary. It's just you may be able to have a look at it from a slightly different angle, and maybe one, as Alan is a researcher in sodium and sweat, maybe just looking at it from his angle as well and finding what works best for you.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat. So are we talking about 30% replacement of the sweat concentration test? We're talking about 30% replacement of the sodium loss per hour. So the milligram per hour amount that you're losing, which is based on both the sweat concentration and the sweat rate, the sweat fluid rate.
Yeah, so I think now he'd be asking, like, say he got a test done on his sweat sodium concentration, which would be milligrams per liter. He'd be given, are you saying base that on 30% of that?
Yep.
Yeah, could I ask, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could ask a question. Yeah, I did a sweat concentration test with a popular company. I won't mention names. Yeah, it came out at 1494 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat.
Mm-hmm.
And their recommendation was to, during a race, to intake 1,500 milligrams, which I've found to be excessive. So I just wanted to clarify that percentage.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
no,
do
totally
not, I do
agree.
not know. Yeah, I need to do more homework on my sweat rate. But my sweat concentration per this company's test is, call it 1,500 milligrams of sodium per liter, which is quite a lot. So,
Yeah,
what percentage do I replace? That's what I wanted clarification on.
yeah, probably about 30% of that. So if you're doing it in milligrams per liter, then you can take that milligram per liter and take 30% of that and replace in milligrams per liter. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect relationship, but it's probably a good place to start without going into massive amounts of mathematics and everything. That's probably the best place to start, is take 30%. So yeah, you're looking at what, about 500 milligrams per liter.
Yeah,
And
because
look,
I've tested 1,015 different races, and I've had GI issues. It was just bloating, and it was a lot of, it was difficult. I could not do it.
Yeah, makes sense.
And no, on that, like, again, that 30% comes in around 500 or just under 500 milligrams, which again,
significantly lower.
That could be, but again, you don't have to replace 100% of that, is what we're saying. But you could start with one pH 1000 tablet, which is 500 milligrams. You could pop that in. That would give you that. If you went to the slightly higher percentage of, say, 60% of that value, it's still around 900 milligrams. So it's still well under like that amount. And again, I think like what Alan's saying is same with fluid loss. You don't have to replace 100% of your fluid loss. And
obviously how much fluid you drink will kind of change the amount of sodium you theoretically need. But I think what we're saying here is there's enough room for error in both directions that if you undershoot or overshoot by 20% or something, it's really not going to make a massive difference in the scheme of things. In one case, you might get a little bit thirstier. In one case, you might have to pee a little bit more, but it's probably not going to be any more or less worse than that. So yeah, I wouldn't get too caught up in it. I mean, there's some people that have extremely high sweat sodium concentrations, but I guess the thing I'd say here too is if you're drinking enough to replace, let's just say 80% of your fluid losses, the sodium replacement percentage number should always be lower than the fluid replacement number. And that's just because the sweat sodium concentration is always, no matter how salty it is going to be less than the blood sodium concentration. So if you're replacing 80% of your fluids, you should definitely not be replacing more than 80% of your sodium losses.
Does that make sense, Noah?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so how do we put this all together in preparation for race day? And I say in preparation because there is a period of preparation that you should ideally kind of undertake. So the first thing is we want to be doing multiple sweat rate tests in race-like conditions using the app. And you want to do those as much as you can. It's not always possible just because of climate where you live compared to where you're going to race. Trying to do that as much as you can across sort of the minimum and maximum expected temperatures or conditions that you're going to experience on race day as well. So that might mean doing some sessions early in the morning where it's quite cool to simulate what it's going to be like early on the bike. And then doing some sessions, in the hottest part of the day, particularly some of your run sessions, which might simulate when you're going to be running on race day as well. What we want to do is build a profile, as I said before. So it's not about doing that one-off sweat rate test and saying, this is my number. It's about building that profile over time to say, my minimum sweat rate that I expect on race day will be about this on the bike. And maybe my maximum expected sweat rate on both the bike and the run will be around this at race pace. Because remember, the pace is going to have a big influence on your sweat rate as well, because of how much body heat you're producing during exercise. The next thing, and we talked about this last week, is figuring out where thirst gets you. So are you someone who tends to not drink very much and loses a lot of body weight when you're drinking according to thirst? Do you finish your sessions constantly thirsty but overhydrated, or constantly not thirsty but underhydrated? That will give you some sort of sense of how much you should listen to thirst. That's particularly important in your longer sessions, because there will be some sessions where you don't get thirsty until you lose much fluid and you just don't lose enough fluid in a shorter session to get to that point. So particularly think about thirst in those longer training sessions, so your long rides and runs on the weekends. Identify the barriers to better hydration. This comes back to a comment I made last week during Scott's presentation, is if you're someone who's not drinking enough during exercise and you're consistently losing, 2, 3, 4% body mass during, even a 2-hour session, then we need to understand why you're not drinking enough during exercise. Is it because your thirst is not telling you to drink more? And in that case, you need to sort of rethink how you kind of interpret your sensation of thirst while you're exercising. Is it that you don't tolerate that from a gut perspective? So maybe I finished and I was thirsty, but I just couldn't drink it because it just sat in my stomach, and that was the problem. That's the barrier that I need to overcome, is to go away and do some gut training to improve my fluid tolerance so I can get in enough fluid to meet my maximum expected sweat rate during exercise. Or in training, is it simply a fluid availability issue? So I'm going out and ideally I would be drinking, 1 liter of fluid, but I'm only taking a 600 ml bottle with me on my bike. Or I'm going out and doing a run and losing 800 mils in an hour, but I don't take any fluid with me at all. And so it's more a planning issue there. And, Scott talked about this last week in terms of setting up some simulations in some of his run training, particularly getting closer to race day, where you actually set up like little mock aid stations where you can access fluid every certain amount of miles or kilometers based on what you would expect your aid stations to be distanced apart on race day. And so you get used to having access to that amount of fluid and having to drink it while you're running, or drinking it and then, continuing to run. I think one thing I do see is that pure runners do this a lot worse than, say, pure cyclists, because they don't carry enough water because it's too inconvenient in their training. And so they never build up that gut tolerance to fluid that a pure cyclist does, because they can carry fluid with them. And so for triathlon, you're sort of somewhere in the middle. But the key thing here is to make sure you do some of your training sessions running with plenty of access to fluid so you can train your gut to get used to that. Then we want to plan the amount of fluid that you need.
Quick one on the thirst, and maybe this is the whole can of worms, but my understanding is in the latter phase of menstrual cycle, thirst can be diminished in the luteal phase. Is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, you get some changes.
Maybe women need to be. Yeah, just women being aware of that, maybe in that latter phase of their menstrual cycle, being aware that thirst may be diminished, and therefore maybe, again, testing, not just maybe testing in the first half of the month and then second half of the month, and again, comparing that, putting notes in your comments about, this was my luteal phase versus, follicular phase, and maybe for women thinking about that in their notes. And again, that subjective information could be huge for them understanding, I've got a race in the later part of the month. I need to be aware of that because I know my thirst is diminished in that part of my cycle. So I think that's maybe one thing just for female athletes to think about. And then my understanding is for postmenopausal women as well, thirst can be diminished. And again, that may be something or older athletes, I think men and women, I think thirst diminishes as we get older. So be aware of that if you are an older athlete, male or female. Thirst may be just inhibited from a psychological standpoint, and be aware of that. It's all very interesting, and again, not hard and fast rules, but things to consider, especially if you are seeing huge loss of body mass in those sessions, which would be applicable to water weight loss, and you're not managing to control it. Like, are these factors that you're not controlling? Are these the barriers that aren't allowing you to perform at your best, is what, I think we're getting at.
Yeah. And I think, as you build that profile and you do lots of sweat tests, and I think, Scott, you mentioned last time that, you've had athletes that have literally done over 100 tests in some cases. They just make it a habit whenever they do a session that's kind of a long session or a race pace session, they'll just plug the data in just to build that profile. And I think, part of building that profile is having the numbers, but the other part is you just get a good feel for everything over time. Like, if you do it enough, you'll get a pretty good understanding of where you're at and what the barriers are, even without the actual numbers and facts and data.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. Like, you just have your scales there. You're not doing it to check your body weight. It's nothing to do about that. It's checking your hydration status and understanding your fluid requirements and whatnot. And once you get in that habit of just stepping on, stepping off, recording it, it just becomes second nature, and you do really build that that profile on yourself, which no one else can do apart from you.
Yep. All right. So part 2 is you planning your fluid for race day. And as I said before, base that on the worst case scenario. So an unexpectedly hot day, what is that maximum sweat rate that you might expect to have on that worst case day? And obviously that's then around planning your fluid availability. So are you going to be relying on aid stations to get that fluid? Are you going to carry that yourself, particularly on the bike? And therefore, how much do I need to carry? So that'll help you plan the types of fluids, the types of bottles that you use, and the size of the bottles, the mounting points on the bike. And I'll come back and talk about that again shortly. And your plan for aid stations, how many aid stations are you going to use to access fluid along the course? Planning your carbs to be consumed either within or separate to fluids. We've already talked about that, so I won't go into detail about that again. The other thing I think for some people to consider is if they're using a source of carbohydrate in their fluids that is not the product that's provided on the course, is that you may have to take powder to refill your bottles if you need to drink more bottles than you can actually carry. So, I often have athletes that are carrying a bottle's worth of powder in a Ziploc bag with them in their back pocket or somewhere on the bike. And then when they get to an aid station, they grab a bottle of plain water and then they put the powder from the Ziploc bag into that water and away they go. They've made up another drink according to what the same ones that they had at the start of the race that were on their bike in T1. So sometimes that's useful. I think where possible, if you can use the course provided product, that's just easier. It also helps in case you drop a bottle or spill one, or your packet of powder falls out of the back pocket or whatever along the course, then you can just get another one on the course. You're not so reliant on the stuff that you're using. But there are times where that's just unavoidable because you really don't like the product they have, or it's just not suitable for your needs. But I would say to most triathletes, wherever possible, try to use the same product that's provided on course. And practice using that in training in the lead up to the race, because it'll just make your life so much easier and give you that plan B and plan C. If things go wrong, you can always access more. And then finally, practice all of this in training. Get used to the bottle arrangement that you have on the bike. Get used to grabbing cups on the run without spilling it all over yourself, or decide whether you're going to walk through aid stations or try to run through them. Recalibrate that relationship between thirst and how much you're drinking, and what thirst is telling you, if it tends to lead you to over drinking or under drinking. Or, as I said, if gut tolerance is holding you back from getting enough fluid, then you need to train that. So again, going out and training with volumes of fluid that are uncomfortable for a period of time. Not to the point where you're vomiting or anything like that, but to the point where, it does feel uncomfortable. And what you'll find is if you continue that volume of fluid after a few weeks, if you do that 2 or 3 times a week, after 3 or 4 weeks, it'll feel less uncomfortable. And then you can potentially push it higher if you still need to go further, and continue to do that until you get up to the maximum kind of fluid volume that you might need on race day. Okay, so thinking about this from a practical standpoint on the bike, I guess some of the questions that you might have to answer, and things that I've seen with athletes over the years. Firstly, can I access my fluids safely and comfortably? So depending on your mounting points for your bottles, between the aero bars is obviously an easy one to drink from, but it's a limited amount. Some people find the ones around the back are great. Obviously good from an aero point of view, but some people find them really difficult to reach around and grab those bottles, either without dropping them or without risking crashing their bike. And I have heard of people that have crashed on the bike try to access those bottles around the back. So if that's you need to practice that in training. And maybe it's practicing it where the bike's on the turbo trainer at home at first, where it's a stationary bike and it can't fall over. Get comfortable with that and then do it out on the road on an easy ride, and then build that up. Some people can do it easily, but for some people, it takes a lot of practice to get used to that. As I said before, what happens if I drop a bottle? What's my contingency for that? If that bottle had my carbohydrate in it, how do I access a backup of carbohydrate? Having some spare gels maybe as an alternative if I need to, or having some spare bags of powder that I can just add to some water I can pick up along the course can be helpful. And how do I get enough carbs when I need more bottles than I can carry? As I said before, having those Ziploc bags of powder can be helpful, or you're going to be reliant on the product that's provided on the course. So it's up to you to decide which one of those you want to do. Or some people might even get a gel and squeeze that into a bottle and dilute it in water as well. That's another way of doing it.
And I'd certainly direct athletes to one of the Q&A sessions where we've done a couple of the practical elements of carrying your carbs, and we sort of went through from professional athletes like from Holly all the way through to age groupers, good age groupers to age groupers who are just starting off and how they're managing that. So it's definitely worth, there's 2 Q&A sessions on YouTube for that, that athletes are definitely encouraged to look at.
Cool. All right. And then on the run, obviously you're probably not going to be carrying much or any, in some cases, fluids with you. So you need to be thinking about things like, how often do I need to get fluids? Do I need to get them at every aid station, every second aid station? That'll differ depending on the person. You might like to be someone who grabs heaps of fluid at one aid station and skips the next one, or gets a little bit at every aid station. It'll depend a little bit on your fluid requirements as well. You need to think about things like, well, how much fluid is actually in one of those cups that I get handed? Do you actually know how much fluid is in one of those? Typically, I would say they're probably only about half full, and you can probably see the picture, the one that's being held here. You can see that it's only poured up to about a third of that line there, and this is an Ironman race. And so, you know, a cup of fluid is not going to be your standard 8 ounces or 250 mils or whatever it is. It's going to be probably half of that at best. And so you need to think about that when you're doing your planning of how many cups do I need to drink. Should I carry fluid or rely on aid stations? Again, that's going to be really personal preference. You can see this guy's got a fuel belt, which is more for diluted gels, but that will provide some fluid. Some people will actually carry a soft flask like trail runners do, or others will prefer just to use cups and bottles from aid stations. How do I drink without spilling it all over me? There are specific techniques that you can use to pick up particularly the paper cups and make a little spout out of them and then drink it. Much easier to do. You can do that while you're running and actually not spill too much. Do I run or walk the aid stations? Again, that probably depends on how much fluid you need to get down, how comfortable you are with picking up a cup and drinking it on the run. Again, all of this stuff is, you can improve it, but it takes practice. Practice in training is really important for all of this stuff, both on the bike and the run. All right, that's me done. Hopefully that gives people a bit of a sense of some of the issues you need to consider. I guess the key messages here is it's definitely not a one size fits all. You need information to inform what you're going to do, which is why doing those sweat rate tests, the more you can do, the better. And it is a moving target. So you need to build that profile of sweat rates and fluid needs over, you know, the cooler conditions and the warmer conditions at race pace.
Do you want to just unshare just quick presentation? Just go through this. Oh. Stop recording.